Really happy to welcome all of you today and hope that there is something for everyone that you feel is relevant to your work. I want to explain a little bit about the rules in a second, but to introduce myself, I am Veronica Olazabal, Senior Advisor and Director of Measurement and Evaluation and Organizational Performance at the Rockefeller Foundation, and I will be your moderator for today. So you will see me popping in and popping out, prompting you for questions, and we will be taking questions throughout. So next slide, please. So as I explain a little bit of the norms and rules for the session, I wanted to mention to you that we are prompting questions throughout the entire session. And there will be moments in time where we will pause and we will ask for questions. And so please feel free to just type into the chat box whether you have a clarifying question, whether you have a very thoughtful or provocative or deep question. We will pick and choose which ones we answer throughout the session. We cannot get to all the questions. And if you would do us a favor and share with us your name and your country so that we know where the question is coming from and who it's coming from. Next slide, please. So before we get started, I wanted to share that this session is prompted by a Rockefeller Foundation publication that was recently launched called Measuring Results and Impact in the Age of Big Data. And it was followed by a blog post by our colleagues and the authors of the actual paper called Pete York. The authors are Pete York and Michael Bamberger, who many of you probably know and who are our panelists for today. And so there were three main ideas that we want to get a little bit into throughout these sessions this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. One of which is that technological advances in mobile phones, GIS, remote sensing, many digital instruments out there have dramatically shifted how we as measurement and evaluation and even program people measure and evaluate progress. The second of which is that there are many tools and techniques that are already being used in the data science space that can be applied to the measurement and evaluation of impact space. And that hopefully can enable faster, more robust generation of results. And finally, that one of the main messages is that the path forward is one that sits at the nexus of data science and evaluation. And we're going to explore that further today. So we have set up the sessions today to do two things. The first part is to dive deeply into some of the messaging around the report, and our colleagues Michael Bamberger and Peter York will do that part. And then we'll take a break, and then the second session is to actually do. How does my work really change? And we're going to hear from an implementing agency focused on work in Asia, our colleague Swampmill from Sambodi, and then we will also hear from the Independent Evaluations Group very own Jos Vassen. And so with that said, I'm going to transition over one more slide. Next slide, please. Yes, next slide, please. Thank you. I'm going to transition over to our first speaker. I probably don't need to share this, but our first speaker is Michael Bamberger. And Michael, as many of you know, has been involved in development evaluation for more than 40 years. His publications include integrating big data into the monitoring and evaluation of development programs, dealing with complexity in development evaluation, a practical approach, and of course, real-world evaluation, which is in its third edition. So Michael, given your expertise in evaluation, what does evaluation look like in the age of big data? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? And with that, I will turn it over to Michael and you will stop seeing me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Veronica, and hello everyone, and welcome. So I'm going to be giving an introduction to some of the challenges facing current evaluation approaches, and then to consider some of the ways that big data can help to address some of these challenges. And then I'll finish just with some suggestions of how big data can help us to do evaluation in the age of the pandemic. So Next slide, please. So this is the outline of what I'm going to be covering. So next. So just to begin with a definition, next slide, please. A definition of what we mean by big data, data science, and data analytics. So big data and data analytics together form what a lot of people call data science. So big data is normally defined as a study which is too large to analyze on a single computer, where data is generated very fast, it's always on, it's non-reactive in the sense that analyzing the data doesn't affect the responses in the way that it can do if you're working with a survey. And normally it's networked, though your one computer is linked into a broader network. The data analytics involves organizing an analysis of the dissemination of the big data, creating integrated data platforms, using predictive analytics, and increasingly machine learning and artificial intelligence. So these together form data science. So next, please. So I would like in this introductory session just to review some of the challenges which are facing conventional evaluation methods. Obviously, not every evaluation has all of these problems, but they're fairly common. The first is that the cost and time of collecting data is very high, which means that most evaluations have to work with relatively small samples, which limits the kinds of analysis which can be done. It's also difficult to collect data in real time. There can be a delay of 6 or 9 months, a lot of studies before the results come out. It's hard to collect data on very large geographical areas because of the expense and the complexity, so you tend to focus more just on the project area which you're looking at. Very hard to collect longitudinal data over many years, which is a big challenge if you're trying to find if your program is sustainable. It's also difficult, many evaluation methods, to monitor processes and behavioral change. Evaluation's better at measuring the situation in a particular point of time and comparing with another particular point, but the process of change is difficult. Also, because of expense, other factors, it's often difficult to identify and include some of the more difficult to reach groups. So you find a lot of evaluations have a footnote saying, unfortunately, we couldn't study the poorest communities because they were so far away, it would take too long and be too expensive to be able to interview them. So some of the key groups you'd like to study often sort of fall through the cracks because of these time and cost constraints. Next, please. There's also recently beginning to realize there's a lot of complexity challenges, that every evaluation starts saying this program is complex, and then that's the last you hear about complexity in many evaluations. You then have a simple model of assuming that there's only a few inputs producing a few outputs and that there are clear linear relationships between the two. And this is not the way, unfortunately, the world works. So this is one of the big challenges of how we can evaluate complexity. So next, please. So this is what we mean by complexity. This is a simple complexity map. The blue box is the intervention itself, which in many cases may be relatively simple, but it's operating at the top box in a system which involves political, economic, cultural, demographic, climatic factors which affect your project in many ways. On the right, there's the fact that all of the institutions and stakeholders, of which there could be up to 100 in some large projects, they're all interacting with each other, often not coordinating very well, sometimes in conflict, sometimes have different objectives. So this has a major influence on the project. And then at the bottom, the challenges of causality and change. The fact that the processes of change are very complex. There's a multitude of inputs which are being processed through many different intervening variables and producing very large numbers of outputs in different combinations in different contexts. So you can have the same set of inputs producing different outcomes depending on these contextual variables. So this is the complexity challenge of the real world in which evaluations are being conducted. Next, please. So because of these factors, there are major analytical and dissemination challenges for many evaluations. It's difficult to analyze really large volumes of data. Normally, you can't integrate different data sets. They tend to have to be analyzed separately. So it's very difficult often to look at the patterns of relationships between different kinds of data. Very difficult to do real-time analysis and dissemination of findings. So many evaluations have very interesting insights, but you don't hear about them until the program has ended. So one of the challenges is how you can conduct your evaluation, disseminate the results sufficiently fast that the findings can be used to improve the performance of the ongoing program. And then the final challenge is of predictive modeling. Many evaluations are looking backwards. They're telling you in a lot of detail what has happened up until the time when the project ends. But for the program manager, for a policymaker, what you'd really like is some guidance on how to predict potential challenges or opportunities with your program, how to strengthen it as the program is progressing. So forward-looking predictive modeling is a big challenge for many evaluations. So next, please. So I'm going to stop here. I've just tried to show a few of the challenges facing current evaluations, and then after the discussion, we'll go on to think about how big data and data science can help to address some of these problems. So over to you, Veronica.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. You cannot see me, but you can hear me. This is the point where we would like to prompt for any particular questions that are out there before we move further into the presentation. So if you have a question, this is your moment to, number one, tell us who you are, your name, and also what your question is. So I'll give you maybe 1 minute, or not even 10 seconds to do that. Please use the poll lev function in your webinar. Oh, I've been told to give you a minute. We will have an opportunity for more Q&A afterwards, but we did want to ensure that we provided an opportunity for anyone who had clarifying questions to ask. So I'm not hearing any questions at the moment. I'm looking towards the team that is on the other side. Shall I go ahead and move forward with the discussion with Michael? Oh, got a question. Lauren from the Netherlands. Hello, Lauren. Her question is, Michael, can you give any examples of how predictive modeling has worked in evaluation successfully? And Michael, feel free to direct us perhaps to the second set of conversations with Pete York, or further out if you are going to go through any particular examples in your response. Over to you, Michael.
Right. Good afternoon, Lauren. Pete is going to be talking about predictive modeling. So perhaps I'll leave that to him to give the specific example. But just one of the areas which I'll be talking about at the end of this session is how big data is being used in the age of the COVID-19. And one of the things which people are beginning to do is to use combine satellite images with survey data, which is geotagged to the satellites, to identify the potential hotspots where it's anticipated that the coronavirus incidence will become higher. So that's one example, but I think Pete will probably give another example from some of the work which he's doing. So I'll leave that to Pete, and when the two of us are in our discussion at the end of the presentations, we can come back to that.
Excellent. And then we have another question They did not share with us their name or location. And so, however, the question is, how do these concepts apply to small projects? Michael, over to you.
Thank you. That's an interesting question. If you're working with a small project, you have challenges in terms of the resources which you may have available for doing some of these kinds of data collection. But one of the messages with data analytics is that you can use these techniques for analyzing small projects as well as large. So that's one point. The second is that a lot of the new kinds of big data are becoming much cheaper, or in many cases free. So even a relatively small project, for example, you can have access to analyzing social media. A lot of work is now being done on Twitter, for example, for identifying, for example, in real time, potential issues like increases in ethnic tension or hunger. So there's a lot of tools which can be now available, either free or relatively cheap. The caution always is that, for example, something like Twitter, even though that may be free, you have to realize you may have to put in several months of work to prepare the data into a form where you can understand what it means and do the kind of analysis which you require. But one of the messages is a lot of these kinds of data are becoming increasingly available at a free or at a relatively low cost.
Thank you, Michael. And that question came from Aditya from India. A very good question. As a moderator, I will say that often the concepts of big data and even data science and machine learning are thought to be only applicable to big projects. And so I thought that question was particularly interesting. And there might be one more question. We're going to pause. But I will take this question. It is about inherent biases in algorithms, and we can probably get to that in a deeper way after our session with Pete York. So back over to you, Michael. And sorry, Michael, before I hand it back to you, I want to make sure if you have questions, please do use the live chat function because we are going to be taking questions throughout, and we want to make sure that we set ourselves up to have a rich discussion afterwards. Back to you, Michael.
Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to be going through quickly some of the potential benefits of big data. I can't cover all of the points, but you will have the slides available to go into more detail. So I'm going to try to show some of the ways that big data can potentially address some of the evaluation challenges. And then I'll go through quickly giving a list of some of the different kinds of big data which are available. So one of the first benefits of big data is that you can collect large volumes of data very relatively cheaply and very fast. So it now becomes possible to cover the whole of the population if you wish to, rather than just a small sample. And this has tremendous implications in terms of the kinds of analysis which you can do. It becomes easier to include a lot of the more difficult to access groups. For example, the groups which are geographically remote, things like satellite images, among other techniques, or if people have access to call-in radio programs or cell phones, you can identify and get information on groups which were previously very difficult to reach. Also, there are groups which may be difficult to identify. For example, in a lot of countries, the refugees or the immigrant population may not appear in many of the government data sets, so they may get missed in a lot of conventional evaluations. And so there's a lot of techniques now which can be used to identify and contact these groups, and I'll give an example a little bit later. And then there's tremendous advantage of real-time feedback, that you can provide information very quickly to managers and policymakers to help improve the performance of programs rather than just waiting to the end. Just one example is using something like Twitter to identify areas of high levels of hunger. Study was done recently in factories in Indonesia, identifying increasing antagonism to women workers. So you can get very fast feedback from a lot of these techniques. So that's a very exciting and very powerful tool. Next, please. You can also access a much wider range of data. One of the very exciting areas is that you can now get longitudinal data from things like satellites. So you may be able to have a data set covering a period of up to 20 years so that you can look at the situation before your project began in terms of the distribution of houses, of the forest cover, the irrigation systems. You can look at this several years before your program began. And very importantly, you can continue looking at the program area after your project is ended so that you can track sustainability, which is one of the very, very weak points of conventional evaluation methods. So longitudinal data is very powerful. Increasingly with social media data beginning to cover a larger number of years as well. So then you can combine multiple sources of data into an integrated data platform. You can merge administrative data from your organization with government survey data, something which Swapnil will be talking about in the second session. You can bring in audiovisual data, satellite data. Once you create this data platform, everything is in the form of zeros and ones, so you can equally well include a photograph as you can include text. Then the other kind of very important data which is now becoming available is text analytics. Many organizations have hundreds of thousands of PDF documents, all of their project records, administrative data going back over years, and it's just sitting somewhere. Nobody's ever able to use it because it's so complicated. Now with text analytics, you can scan very quickly very, very large data sets. And for example, if you wanted to look at how the World Bank had changed its attitudes to gender over the years, you could scan all of the bank's records and see whether identify all of the references to gender, and then look at what approach is being used. So this is a very exciting, powerful tools. It sounds rather boring just to be analyzing PDF documents, but it's for many organizations one of the most valuable tools you can use. Then there's a lot of techniques you can track processes and behavioral change. Things like social media, cell phones, some of the new techniques of collecting data from phone companies to track all of the calls which are being made. You can study real-time changes in mobility patterns. You can see if people now have a regular job, so they're traveling every day to work. You can look at interactions between different family members, look at the increasing size or dynamics of social networks. So you can look at behavioral change in a way which is very difficult to do before. So next, please. You can also have more sophisticated kinds of data analysis. We've talked a little bit about predictive analytics, and Pete I think we'll be coming back to that again, but just the idea of being able to make recommendations on how a program should change its interventions, and then test whether you get an improvement in performance and keep making real-time changes based upon the predictive analytics. Then you can bring together a lot of different multiple data sets and look at the associations between them. Swapnil is going to be talking about in India, where they're beginning to think about how you can get access to all of the government survey data in different sectors, bring it all together to look at relationships between health, poverty, education, previously, which were completely separate. Then artificial intelligence is now enabling us to scan and organize data in many different ways. So Pete will be talking, I keep putting the blame on Pete for all of the tricky things, but he will be talking about how you can create quasi-experimental designs using natural experiments within your data sets. So that's also a very powerful set of tools. Next, please. It also becomes possible to analyze complexity. One of the key things with complexity is looking at the systems analysis, and there's a lot of tools becoming available now, systems mapping, social network analysis, systems dynamics, which enable us to understand the organizational context in which programs operate. These techniques are just beginning to be used in evaluation, but they're available. contextual analysis, looking at the broader geographical, political, economic areas in which programs operate, and then the tracking processes of change. So next, please. Just to give you a list of some of the kinds of big data which are available. You're probably familiar with most of these. The geospatial data from satellites and drones, social media, Twitter and Facebook we hear a lot about, but in a lot of areas like rural Africa, radio call-in programs are also a very powerful tool used quite a lot in evaluation. Internet searches, you can see how many people are asking for information on job opportunities in other cities or other countries. Use this as a predictor of plans to migrate. Phone call center records is something which many of you may not used yet, but all phone companies are required to keep records of all of the calls which have been made, not the content, but just who called, when, and to where did they call. And so this is being used, for example, a study I'm working on in Turkey of evaluating the integration of refugees into the Turkish society by tracking the phone calls, what percentage of the calls are made to other refugees, what percentage are made to Turkish citizens, how many people seem to be moving during the course of the day, probably to work. So there's a lot of very exciting things you can do with this, the call center records. Mobile phone data, we're very familiar with what can be done with that. The administrative data sets, we've already mentioned that. And then the Internet of Things, your Apple Watch, you can monitor a lot of health indicators, your mobility patterns, your purchasing patterns, who you interact with. So there's a lot of exciting things can be done with the Internet of Things. So you can see there's a very wide range of tools which are potentially available for use in the evaluations, and not all are appropriate for every evaluation, so you have to pick and choose, but a lot of people just use one kind of big data. So remember, there's a whole menu of things potentially available. So next slide, please. I had a couple of slides on methodological challenges, which I'm going to skip over because of the time, but you have this here for your reference. And so big data is very, very exciting, tremendous opportunities, but you have to be cautious. There's a number of issues there, which we'll probably come back to later. So next, please. So this is some other issues. And so next, please. So the final slide is just to give us some ideas of some of the potential ways that big data is starting to be used for conducting evaluations in the time of the pandemic, when conventional evaluation approaches of face-to-face interviews and so on becomes difficult or impossible. So just very quickly to run through a list of some of the potential tools which are already being used. There are many ways to collect data remotely. We've talked about satellite images, phones, social media analysis. So these become very powerful when you're not able to meet with people personally. Contextual analysis, very critical for analyzing the spread of the pandemic. So many different factors which affect geographical, sociocultural, economic. And so just being able to look at the big picture of all of the factors which are affecting the spread is very, very powerful tools. Real-time data generation, again, when the pandemic spreads so quickly, if you wait for 2 weeks before you've got feedback on changes in the incidence rates, another 1,000 people could be infected. So real-time data, being able to get feedback very quickly is very critical. We should always remember that the term real-time data in some cases can be several weeks. It isn't necessarily just you press the button and everything's there immediately, but it's very, very fast. Using satellites and drones in quite a few countries now, these are being used to identify virus hotspots and to predict whether the virus seems to be spreading. Monitoring social distance and contact tracing, we're all familiar with these techniques which health agencies are trying to put in place, and that they can also be used for other things besides just that kind of contact tracing. In another field, they're used a lot, for example, for looking at the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. You can look at identify the high transmitters using some of these techniques. One thing which is just becoming quite interesting is facilitating citizen feedback, that you're now opening up new channels for people to be able to give feedback to government, and promoting social solidarity, which people are just becoming aware of, that in many neighborhoods, setting up social networks so that people are becoming much more familiar with their neighbors, identifying people who have problems of health or mobility, and people are starting to go out and shopping or collecting medicines. It's beginning to strengthen social networks in a way which wasn't happening before. And finally, excuse me, integrating health, economic, and social data into a single platform. These pandemics are so complex, both in terms of the medical factors, but also what are the impacts on employment, on gender-based violence. So just being able to bring together in an easily accessible form a very wide range of different kinds of data is a very powerful tool. So we can see there's a lot of potential use for big data and data analytics. An example of the virus, but in many other areas. So this is an exciting new field, tremendous opportunities. The whole face of evaluation will have changed 5 years from now. So I'll pass you back to Veronica and look forward to getting into the discussion with you a little bit later.
Thank you, Michael. We have a number of questions that have come in, and you have done a wonderful job of speaking about the opportunities. I know that you did not speak about challenges. Some of the questions that have come in are in that area. And so, speaking of real-world evaluation, John from Brazil asks, isn't big data usually biased against those who do not have internet access? Over to you, Michael. What are your thoughts there?
Bom dia, senor. So there's an issue of bias. One of the concerns is that many advocates of big data claim that it doesn't have bias. They say we're collecting data from 100,000 people, what I call the myth of big data. If you're collecting data from a lot of people, it must not have biases. You often hear this said, but it's very rare that big data is covering everybody. As the question was pointing out, if you don't have a cell phone, if you don't have access to some of the social media, you're likely to be left out. So there's a lot of biases. One example of a bias which is often harder to detect is if you're looking at gender issues. Very often a woman has access to a phone, but unless you're actually doing some ground truthing, some participant observation, you don't know whether the woman actually has what kind of access she has to the phone. Maybe when she's making a call, the mother-in-law is sitting on the windowsill with her arms folded, listening to what her daughter-in-law is saying. There have been some studies, for example, in Zambia, that every evening the man comes home, he demands his wife's phone, he looks through all of the phone numbers she's called, he rings some of the numbers. If a man responds, he beats up his wife. So there's kind of biases or exclusions which you may not know about. And one of the messages is that you should always use mixed methods of ground truthing, of combining the data from the social media with what you actually observe on the ground. So this is something which is very critical. Now, this is not just criticizing big data. If ever you use conventional evaluation methods, there's biases there. You don't interview the truck drivers because they're away traveling when you're visiting the communities, and the fishermen are never there because they're out at sea. There's certain people hide from you if they're illegal squatters. They don't want to be interviewed because they're afraid that they'll be thrown out of the community. So every method has bias, but I think one of the new issues with the big data, I've found a lot of data scientists, I would say, are rather arrogant. Our methods are so much better than conventional evaluations. We have huge amounts of data. We eliminate bias. So you have to be reflexive and humble, whatever technique you're using. So thank you for the question.
Excellent. And your point around triangulation or triangulation, excuse me, is very well taken, in that a new data source or a new type of analytical method isn't going to solve our problem. As from the evaluation community, I believe that we should reflect on that part. So now, Innocent from Cape Town asks, by advocating for the use of big data in evaluation, does this mean that there are new competencies needed for evaluators to enable them to conduct data analysis? Over to you, Michael.
Thank you. I was in Cape Town recently, working with Slum Dwellers International. It's a very beautiful city. Yes, one of the big challenges with data science is that data scientists and evaluators have different sets of competencies. Most data scientists are not very familiar with evaluation methods, and many evaluators are not familiar with big data. So when the two groups try to interact, often there are misunderstandings because of a lack of knowledge. A lot of evaluators are very suspicious about the way that big data scientists treat data. They think that they're rather irresponsible, using a lot of very poor quality data, with data which has different kinds of biases, and saying, don't worry, we'll use artificial intelligence and everything will get solved. So there's a lot of misunderstandings at the moment with, so there is a need for some kind of capacity development where data scientists and evaluators are developing a joint curriculum. So that is very important. And just want to preface that one issue there. If you look at how big data is being used in the social sciences, most of it is being used for research. Very little of it is yet being used for evaluation. Data science, the evaluative thinking is a different framework than research, thinking about causality and how you can come up with counterfactuals. So there is still a big gap, some challenges of needing not just capacity development, but thinking of organizational mechanisms where data scientists and evaluators can work together. So this is going to be an exciting challenge for many people on this call.
Excellent. And we're running out of time, so we can't get to the many questions that we are receiving, but please do keep sending your questions in. And don't forget to tell us what your name is and where you're calling from. Before we turn it over to our next panelists, we are going to take one more question, and that, which I think is very relevant to some of the work that Michael has done in the past. And that is, Michael, how do you manage and educate on the ethics of these solutions? What are the ethical considerations?
Yeah. Thank you for bringing this up. That the ethical considerations are really critical. And when you use big data, there's a new set of ethical concerns come in, because questions of privacy, that you can access so much very personal, very sensitive information about people. You really need to put in place very rigid protocols of how you're controlling privacy. And many organizations are just beginning to think about that. A lot of organizations have very inadequate methods for protecting their data, and are just really not familiar with how easy it is to access data if you have sophisticated hackers. So protecting data is very critical. The other issue I'd just like to mention, for not going to more time, one of the big concerns with big data is that it can become what people call extractive. That one of the ways that big data is sold to some organizations is, big data is great. You don't have to waste time going out and talking to people in the communities. You just sit in your office and you will know what they want just analyzing big data. So this is this can be a concern with surveys as well, but it's a particular concern with big data, and that's the way it's often marketed. How much money you can save not having to waste time talking to people. So that's a set of major ethical issues. Big data can be a very empowering tool. It can be used in a way that to give voice to communities, to hold governments accountable. But that won't happen magically unless it's set up, being concerned about these moral and ethical and political issues. So thank you for bringing this up. There's a whole range of very important ethical codes, questions which need to be put in place, and they're starting to come, but there's still many, many gaps.
Thank you very much, Michael. And we are now going to turn over to Pete York. Pete, if you are there, could you turn your camera on? And Michael, as a reminder, can you turn your camera off? And as we transition from one session to another, I will remind you, or maybe share with many of you who may not have seen the Rockefeller paper that we initially discussed earlier in the session. We speak to many of these questions, and so please do go there. It's a very robust report. And so now, Pete, are you there? I just want to make sure I can see you. Yes, you are. There you are. Hello, Pete.
Hello. Good morning.
Great. Good morning or good afternoon. So Pete York, as many of you know, has more than 20 years of experience as an evaluation consultant and researcher. For the past 8 years, he has built predictive, prescriptive, and causal evaluation models using large administrative data sets and machine learning algorithms across many fields. And so before I turn it over to Pete, I want to share a little bit around how we structured this particular session. We wanted to start from the evaluation perspective and speak to what the intersection and the nexus space around data science and evaluation looks like for evaluators. During this part of the discussion and the presentation, we're actually going to speak from more of the data science perspective. And so what does that convergence look like, that integration look like from the data science perspective? So many of you have asked questions around bias in algorithms and the use of predictive modeling. This is a good time to be honing in on Pete's topic and discussion and presentation. And please do continue to ask questions, sharing with us who you are and what country you're coming from. So Pete, can you share more on what the nexus between data science and evaluation looks like from the data science perspective? What should we as evaluation practitioners be considering? Over to you, Pete.
Thank you, Veronica. And yes, good morning and afternoon to everybody from all over the world. I'm appreciative of the broad audience here. So along those lines, Veronica, as I start to talk about this, what I want to create a little bit of a segue here for a moment and share that one of the closing questions for Michael's piece was about the ethics and of big data. And this is where I'm going to transition to the work that I'm going to share with you all, and the approach to how we bring data science and evaluation together. There's a fundamental challenge with a lot of data in that predictive accuracy is something that oftentimes in the big data science world is really the goal, and to be able to predict. And the challenge is that in the evaluation world, we recognize that correlation is not causation. A lot of bias is brought into the work when we analyze data and we presume or ignore the fact that correlation is not causation. And that is a fundamental issue when it comes to really understanding the difference between pure prediction, which can be correlation or causal, or both, or a little bit of both in between. And therein lies a lot of the issues around the bias, and really the challenges with using some of these tools. What I'm going to share is how social science, data science, and big data can come together and are coming together to advance rigorous evaluation and learning. I'm going to begin by noting something that's really important, and that is that social science, the social science research community has been using big transactional data gathered over time for decades. I'm talking about electronic health records, financial transactional data, unemployment claims data, census data, and they have used those big data sets combined with statistical modeling techniques to conduct rigorous cause and effect studies for decades. Just to give you one example, propensity score matching is a big data technique using that types of data. And that is a technique that was introduced in 1983 for finding match comparison groups and studying how different treatments, naturally occurring different treatments, affect the results of different treatments and interventions and experiences. It has resulted in, that technique has resulted in over 250,000 peer-reviewed studies since 1983. So with the rapidly advancing big data technologies and data science techniques that are out there, like machine learning, that data-driven research is taking another evolutionary step, and it's making it possible for those outside of academic institutions to leverage these techniques for more cost-effective, timely, and useful, to borrow Michael's book title, real-world evaluation. What I'm going to share with you is this approach, is an approach to this. So in a very practical sense, kind of how we can start to use this, addressing that issue I was just talking about, that underlying bias we're trying to address that affects so much, which is the difference between correlation and causation, putting predictive accuracy above really understanding what works. I'm coming at this from an experience base of working in dozens, numerous projects, and it includes big and small projects. Big projects for governments, like government agencies like the National Science Foundation, government agencies like the state of Florida in the juvenile justice space, down to small program projects with just a few hundred longitudinal cases in a foster care program, a mental health treatment program, so using program administrative data. So that's the experience base that's coming into this and the applicability of this. So when we say big data, part of what I want to frame this is a lot of this work requires, it's really the idea that the technology and the analysis takes a lot of computing power. It's not just the number of cases in the database, so to speak. So next slide, please. So I'm going to cover in this a big data science approach to evaluation, give you kind of a methodological brief overview, including providing a case example, a more bigger project, but a case example of how it applies. I'm going to share the potential benefits, limitations, and challenges. And throughout my discussion of the methodology, I'm going to provide some content around the data technology and skills required that it'll take for evaluators to really get started. Next slide, please. So I'm going to dive right into the methodological overview to give us a big picture. Again, brief. It's not detailed and technical, but keep going. That's okay. You can go to the next slide. So one of the fundamental pieces is that we are going to have to think of this work moving forward where there's two types of collaborators, evaluators and data scientists. We bring complementary skills, experience, knowledge. There are some competing approaches and philosophies, predictive accuracy versus the idea that we're trying to get to causation and remove some of the biases of that correlation versus causation. So those philosophical differences have to be negotiated. It's really important in this approach that evaluators and subject matter experts are in the driver's seat in this collaborative work, and that really data science and the data scientists, and until these skills come together in training and education, these two collaborators really need to be working, but it's really a technical support role that the data scientists is playing until we bring these all together under one type of job. Next slide. So the overview I'm going to provide, again, briefly, is we have to be able to find and access relevant data sets, prepare the data for evaluation, conduct what we call quasi-experimental modeling. And just really quickly, what we mean by that is, rather than scientists randomly assigning in a controlled experiment, randomly assigning people to treatment and no treatment, we're looking for natural experiments where matched cases, similar cases, where we can see how real-world interventions, some of the same types of cases getting real-world interventions and others not, and then what the effect of that is. And then the fourth step is producing results. So when we say quasi-experimental, it just means we're not having a scientific study that is controlled and random assignment. The random assignment in this case is happening in the real world, where similar cases are getting treated differently, and we look at those treatment differences to see what works. Next step. Next slide, please. So the first step is to find accessible and relevant data sets. From this standpoint, the key here is we're looking for longitudinal data with some stable metrics. We don't need huge number of cases. Most of the work that's in my experience base is in the administrative and government data pieces, because those data do contain some of the less biases and issues in the big data, but we're beginning to then also add on big data. And the key here is that as far as accessibility goes, is we've got to address the quality, which I just mentioned, and then also issues of confidentiality, and of course looking at biases as we start to consider these things. One other thing to note is that oftentimes we can find open, accessible, or we can get permission with the first two types of data sets, but big data sets sometimes do require some pricing to access, some expense to access. Next slide. These are just some of the requirements. I'm not going to go over all of them, but I'll just pause for 5 seconds, 10 seconds to let you see kind of what the evaluator requirements and data science requirements are in this collaborative process for the step 1. And next slide. So the second step is we got to prepare the data. The steps here are laid out. I think what I want to highlight for you all is after we've connected and cleaned, and by the way, we're cleaning missings and we're cleaning skewed data. By the way, the cleaning process by using AI and machine learning, a lot of the data that traditionally the evaluation community has assumed was messy, we can clean up now. So I just encourage everybody to know that cleaning the data and our data that we think traditionally have been way messier than before, there's a lot of techniques and tools now at our disposal, and it's advancing all the time. That means we won't have to leave as much data on in the trash, so to speak. The key to this in preparing the data is really being able to use our subject matter expertise as evaluators and collaborators to filter the variables. There's too much data in these data sets. We've got to take out the variables or the measures that we really want. And then we need to logic model, what we call logic model, label those variables. We have to actually frame all those variables into our theory of change or logic model, literally tagging those with input, strategy, outcome. The reason is that will make our modeling possible so that we're doing theory-based testing in our whole approach. Next slide. These are some of the requirements needed for this type of work. Next slide. So then what we do is the heart of it, which is really the experimental modeling. And there's 3 steps to this. We first find similar cases based on their likelihood to be treated, so to speak. So whatever we're studying, we want to know. And this way we're trying to, whenever we hear about studies that say we've got to study something, we want to know that there's some at least attribution or that's towards causality, not just correlation. Well, in order to do that, we need to match people that are similar on their condition and circumstances so that we can then compare apples and apples, so to speak. We then can train the machine learning algorithms and other tools to find the differences in programs. The same type of cases with similar conditions and circumstances don't always get treated the same way. They're in our experiments. We can use algorithms to help us find those with transparency, by the way, and then we can analyze statistically whether there are significant differences in some of those treatment differences, whether they're getting or not getting, or whether there's just a certain amount of dosage or qualitative experience. And it's very important to note we can use qualitative data in this, unstructured data as well. So we can converge qualitative and quantitative data in this process because some of the stuff that Michael was talking about, including text analytics. So that's really what we're doing. We're finding natural experiments in step 3. Next slide. Some of the tools here that are really important for evaluators and data scientists are listed here. I think this is really important where the evaluator is really bringing that combined expertise of understanding how the data and the analysis process, but also the framework and the work with stakeholders to understand and bring this all together. It's a real bridging role that's important in this step, and it needs to be guided by and directed by the evaluator. Next slide. So then what happens is we can produce results. So now the really potential here, of the great potential here is that we can produce evaluation results like we typically do. We can take those findings, we can even do more qualitative investigation of specific cases, and we can imagine leveraging this to be able to produce typical evaluation reports. But when it comes to utilization of this information and this type of approach to evaluation using bigger data and these big data tools and technologies and data science tools, we can produce better on-demand, up-to-date evaluation findings, broken out by each segment of the population or matched comparison group of the population, as well as the whole, get some sense of attributable success. It's quasi-experimental, so it's not just correlational. We can see that we're at least contributing to outcomes in some cause on the path towards causality. And we can also produce frontline decision-making tools. Those same algorithms can produce solutions for frontlines that help them meet a case where they are, leverage predictive and prescriptive insights in order to plan and then continue to monitor, and their applications and tools that we're able to sit on top of this that you can begin to produce. So it ups the bar in terms of the potential for utilization of this kind of information as well. Next slide. This step requires something that I think would be beneficial to all of the evaluation community, which is understanding a little bit more about how we do human-centered or user-centered design work to leverage data visualization software, dashboard technologies, and create user tools, program evaluation dashboards, as well as frontline decision-making tools, predictive insights. It's going to require some of that human-centered design expertise. And the data science community is going to bring a lot of technical support to this, as well as other computer engineers and developers, is the potential here. Next slide. So let me show you this in action on a big data project. So this is a big project. So this is not a small program, but remember this process can be applied to longitudinal administrative data of a few hundred cases for a small program, for example, providing mental health treatment inpatient for children. This, though, is an example where we're going to examine this question using big data sets and the analytic processes described to answer the question, an evaluative question, does the right level of access to nonprofit direct services improve community well-being? I'm really going to examine specifically, I'm going to walk through this and I'm going to frame it in terms of mental health services. Okay, so next slide. So one important thing is we used a new no-cost tool set. There's an open source, really powerful visual-based analytics software called NIME. It's a German company, but they're all over now. It is open source. There's a great community around it. And the free version can do what we're going to share with you. And Power BI, Microsoft Power BI is an example of a tool we used. There's a free version for that as well for data visualizations and the way to produce reports. Next slide. So the first thing we had to do is find and access relevant data set. So do mental health services improve community well-being over a 4-year period? We got IRS 990 data on nonprofits. We could find all of the direct service providers of mental health services. We knew where they were located. And we could also take the American Community Survey data down to the census tract, of which there's over 70,000 census tracts in the United States. And we could look at their community well-being using area deprivation index, which is a common metric, and look at over time, 4 years, does access to mental health services help to improve community well-being at the census tract level over a 4-year period? Next slide. So then we prepared the data. This is what I was sharing before, where we were able to connect, clean, identify, create, and logic model the evaluation data. This you're seeing is kind of the framework. Essentially, we actually use, this is the power of the tools we now have. We could take those big data sets and we could apply geospatial predictive algorithms to actually be able to calculate and find the ideal distance and amount of mental health service output for each different type of community. And we did so by matching first based on those contextual variables you see here, because these variables affect whether you're going to even have accessible mental health services. So your population density, how your community gets around, and the socioeconomic status will determine whether nonprofit mental health services are even going to be available and what amount will they be available. And so we wanted to control for those. So we have match comparison groups there, and we could use geospatial algorithms to then analyze and find what's the ideal amount and distance, if you will, and amount of services, mental health services needed to predictively move the needle on well-being. And then through this process, we could set the stage here. We used area deprivation longitudinally. So we matched them on those variables. We matched communities also on their baseline area deprivation index. So we knew they were starting at the same place within the same context. Let's look at all those communities that were very similar and see what happens. And it's the next step. Slide, please. The next step is we take a group. So in by way of example here, if you look at this, and I need to actually, if you look at, so for example, if we found that there were urban working poor census tracts with more than 50% public transit, people commuting more than 30 minutes, those communities, when we matched them in that way, and they were similarly likely to have mental health services at a certain level, we could actually look and be able to see and match them. The second step in this, the second part of this is next. After we match them, we could then see whether the ideal level of access to direct services versus the same types of communities with less access, if there was a significant difference. So herein are the natural experiments. We know that we have matched communities based on what you see in the bottom there, urban, working, poor, ... Now we've matched them. Now we know there's counterfactual experiences. Some of those communities over a 4-year period had access to enough mental health services nonprofit, and some did not. Next slide. We could then run the inferentials. Once we see those differences, we can then use our statistical tests to basically see if there's a significant difference and at what level for these. Next slide. And here are the results. So if you look at the first piece here, you're going to see that mental health services controlling for transportation, socioeconomics, population density over a 4-year period was able to there was a difference in terms of community well-being over a 4-year period. And it is a significant and large scale. So we can produce these kind of results. The opportunity here is we can do this in an automated fashion also, because moving forward, we can repeat this on an annual basis as the data come in. Next slide. We can also then, if we want to look at inequities, some of the issue of bias coming in, we can then evaluate communities that are more persons of color versus communities that are more white within those matched comparison groups. And we can see if we know mental health services are important to a community well-being, access to them, we can also then evaluate if there's equity in terms of receiving those. And here we were able to show that there are some inequities here in terms of receipt and accessible mental health services, which you can see here on the left as well. So we can also test some of the equities, and there's ways we've been working on removing bias and testing these inequities in service to a lot of the work that can be done with these kind of tools. Next slide. Lastly, we can create really interesting dashboards, a map. This is the state of Pennsylvania. You can create a dashboard that then looks at each community, and we can actually assess and evaluate each of these communities as to whether they're getting enough or not of different services. We can also see who they are. We can help people visualize where they might want to put their resources, etc. So this is one of those derivatives that we can also do that gives us a sense of the potential of how we can bring these technologies together for evaluation, but then also utilization. Next slide. So let's go ahead with the discussion. And by the way, Veronica, I forgot to also mention that this is obviously a US-based experience, but as you could probably imagine, there are government and program data sets, small and big, that you can begin to leverage these kinds of data science and analytic and algorithmic work techniques to be able to begin to really automate and then benefit a lot of the things that we're talking about. I'll talk about that in a second, but let me pause.
Great. Thanks very much, Pete, for that very rich presentation and walk through the example. We are slowly running out of time, or quickly running out of time. And so I do want to take this opportunity to ask 2 specific questions. One which touches on Lauren, who asked this earlier on during Michael's session. Number 1, which is, can you give any examples of how predictive modeling has worked in evaluation successfully? So maybe building on this one. And then the second one is around a topic that I know that we've talked about often, is how do we deal with inherent biases in algorithms in predicting modeling or predictive modeling?
Yeah, that's really important. So the first one is examples. I'll give you another example. What I just shared with you, we have done work in the space of child welfare, particularly a program and organization that provides services to a few hundred youth aging out of foster care in the United States. And we have been able to take their program administrative data and also leverage the techniques just described, finding the natural match comparison groups, and automating those tools we're describing, which is being able to then provide evaluation dashboards about all the different segments or match comparison groups, how they're doing, attribution of success, as well as being able to then provide frontline workers with predictive and prescriptive insights off of the same model and off of the same tools. And by the way, I'm going to get to the second part in response to that, and I'll segue here, and that is the inherent biases. So there are a lot of inherent biases which are so true. So part of it is we want to remove some of the research orientation biases, the correlation causation, and I described that methodologically. But some of the other biases, we believe that when you're creating comparison groups and you're building models, it's fundamentally important that if a certain demographic variable should have no relationship to whether somebody gets treated or not, it should not be a part of your match comparison group modeling. Persons in the United States that are in the system. We model to the prediction and risk assessment tools to the group that gets treated the best, so to speak. We build those tools and we apply those tools to everyone so that when officers and judges and others are using these risk assessment tools, that the models are not built with all the bias of those that have been brought to the cases that may be persons of color, for example. So there's a number of techniques we really have to be aware of. And lastly, what I would also say, which is really important, is that as we go about this, we should be using algorithms that are transparent. To use deep learning and neural net models for anything other than creating typologies and kind of understanding just general patterns in the data. If we're going to use that for causal modeling, we cannot see what is going into those models. And so we have to be very careful. And I would argue for right now, until otherwise proven, any black box algorithms, I think in any kind of causal modeling process, anything we're trying to remove bias should not be used, or at least be used and discussed and deliberated upon when they are used as to why they are being used. Because even the best data scientists cannot tell you why, for example, Watson can come up with the answer that it comes up with. And in that case, we have to be very careful because it can leverage all kinds of bias because it's, again, based on predictive accuracy. So there's some things we can do to really start to minimize this and still be able to use these tools. Also, by the way, big data, social media, things like that, are likely to be much more biased in many other ways, as we have seen by the way it's actually weaponizing in many cases, current events and other things. So I think at the end of the day, we have to be very careful. Where the data source is, the bias that's already inherent to it, have some transparency, be careful what algorithms we use, and make sure we do everything we can to minimize bias.
Great. So with that, let's segue to the last piece, and noting that we have only a few minutes to complete this piece before we open it up for a little bit of Q&A. Please, sorry, thank you very much.
I'll jump right in, Veronica, and it takes me 2 seconds here. I just wanted to share this slide that says, here's where some of the benefits come in. We can really get rapid. So I'm sharing with you the example I just presented to you in the slides as to the bottom line. It's remarkable how quickly we can build models with data like this that already exists, longitudinal data, how flexibly we can be, quantitative, qualitative, text analytics, all a part of the process. It can be cost effective just looking at it through the number of hours and imagine the cost per hour. We can automate so that we can analyze new data, produce results instantly. And we can make it useful for some of the dashboards and tools and other things, so utilization is maximized. On the other side of this, it's really important to note that there are some challenges, and this is the next slide. The challenges are, we do have to start to get technologically savvy, the collaboration with data scientists and the computer engineering world. In some cases, we will require big data architecture to analyze this data. It's too much for one computer. And ultimately, the other three challenges here are really all about the collaboration. We've got to come together, break down silos, and really learn technically what each other does, data scientists and evaluators, reconcile competing philosophies, this whole philosophy of predictive accuracy versus really kind of removing the bias. and being causally explanatory. These are things that we have to work together, build capacity, and integrate these functions systemically, organizationally, and institutionally. That's it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. If I may ask Michael to turn on his video so that we can spend a few minutes talking and responding to a couple of questions that have come up as we wrap up. So first, I have been asked to announce that the video, the presentation, and a list of resources will be available on the original site that you registered, and there is also going to be a link at the end of this presentation. So thank you very much, Pete. Welcome back, Michael. And so there are several questions around where to start. And very specifically, there was a question from Ninoy from the Philippines, who said, Pete mentioned that there are software packages accessible that can be used for big data analytics. What can he recommend for neophytes in using this approach for evaluation? So that's one piece. And then the second piece, there are various questions around where do you start to become, if you're an evaluator, to access resources or become educated or more educated in these areas. So maybe we can do a quick round with Pete specifically, and then I'll move on to the next question for Michael.
And I can make this pretty quick at a high level. The first thing I would do is I would say that it would be really good to get some preliminary training on causal modeling. I strongly recommend a book written by Judea Pearl, who's actually a Turing Prize winner, UC Berkeley professor, really who has, I think, broken through the problems with data science and explains how we can do causal modeling using existing data and really finding counterfactuals and moving up what he calls the causal ladder. And I think it's a great book. It's called The Book of Why. And it really does explain. It gives a little history, but it also explains kind of what causal modeling and how it looks. And then there are other training and opportunities for people to really get familiar with that. And again, I just want to note decades of work in causal modeling using existing data with hundreds of thousands of studies. Okay, so it's not new. But the use of machine learning and other stuff is really advancing it. The second thing I would say is to get familiar with tools. And I really strongly recommend KNIME, K-N-I-M-E, as an analytics software. If anybody's familiar with other types of tools where we have visual-based analysis software, KNIME is open source, and it's a great tool and a resource, and it also has a community around it, and so you can really get the supports and reach out to that community. Thirdly, I would say any type of online coursework that can teach you about machine learning. Specifically, if you want to learn more about decision tree algorithms or things like random forest decision trees, those are really the best theory-based kinds of algorithms, logic model testing algorithms that we have found in service to causal modeling. So those are some very practical things to get started.
Great. And Michael, this one to you. Program administrative data generally suffers from data issues. Do you think big data can compensate for that when considered in evaluation? And that is from Bidu from India.
Okay, well, thank you for that question. Data quality is a big challenge. One of the things which is important is to become familiar with the data, to look at it fairly carefully, to see what the data covers, what it doesn't cover. Also to talk to people who know how the data was collected. In many countries, it's well known that, for example, a long time ago, I was working in a country and everybody knew that the census data was very unreliable because there'd been a change of government during the period of analyzing the census. They changed all of the staff, but nobody would tell you this. None of the international agencies wanted to say, the government census is terrible. So you could do a lot of work on a data set without knowing the major limitations. So getting to know the data, actually going in the old days, you would actually sort of go and look at some of the questionnaires, see how many missing questions there were. When everything is done electronically, it's a different sort of process. But that's the first question, the first challenge, and there are often going one of the other big things when you're talking about data quality. Many data sets have very big gaps. So there's just very large population groups that don't get covered. In many communities, for example, you only cover the people who have a registered land title or own the house. And so you may not know that there are very large numbers of people who are just missing. One of the concerns Peter and I discuss a lot is evaluators tend to think about what are the limitations of the data, who might not be included, why might refugees not be registered in this data set. Some big data scientists, not all, some jump in and they say, boy, we've got this big data set, let's go and see what we can do with it. And if you ask them, you know, are there any issues of people being excluded? Sometimes they say things like, AI can solve that. And not all, but there's a different approach to, do you start with the data you've got, or do you think what is missing? So that's a very important challenge. But basically being aware of how the data was collected, what might be the limitations, but always start with that. And just one word of caution, I've seen many inception reports for evaluations where the evaluation team went quickly to a country and the Ministry of Health said, we've got this really great data set that you'll be able to use. You put in your inception report, we're going to use the Ministry of Health's data set. When you actually start looking at it, you realize there are big gaps, or it doesn't actually ask the questions that you thought, or it was done 2 years earlier than you thought. So really doing your homework with the kind of data sets that you want to use.
Can I just add also really quickly?
Yeah,
the data, there are also data analytic techniques that are really helping to use predictive analytics, for example, to fill in missing data, to simulate cases with high degrees of accuracy. There are AIs coming into play. So I just encourage you all to know that there are a lot of advances that data science does provide, and they are transparent, that allow us to fix problems we've had historically that we thought were unfixable.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So the future is here, and it sounds like we have some work to do as evaluators to prepare ourselves. As we wrap up, Mike and Pete, very succinctly and quickly, what is the one thing you would recommend we do as evaluators to set ourselves up for this new world that we are living in? Let's start with Michael first.
Okay. I think the big message I would give, a lot of people assume if you're an evaluator, you have to become an expert in big data, all of the questions about what should we read, what kind of courses we should take. And it's good to get up to a certain understanding, but probably the most realistic approach for many people is to develop collaboration with data scientists. So maybe the local university, one of the local UN agencies, one of the bilaterals. There's a lot of people around who are big data specialists. The really key thing is you have to do your homework and know what questions to ask them. If you just go to a big data person and say, please tell us how to go and evaluate the effectiveness of this low-cost housing program, you're going to have trouble. You know, if that person is an expert on big data but not on housing, so you have to do your homework and say, these are the things we want to know. These are the key questions. These are our concerns. How can you help us? So that would be my message of thinking about how you can do your basic homework. What are the key things you need to know? Pete was talking about some of them, of understanding causal models and so on, but then develop the relationships with the people who can help you. And there's a lot of people around who do that have that kind of skill. So that would be a message.
Thank you, Michael. And Pete, wrap us up.
Yes, along those lines, I'm going to piggyback on that and say the first stage is to learn how to be better consumers of data science technical support and assistance. I think evaluators still need to direct and guide. They need to have the frameworks, they need to do that, but they need to basically learn enough about data science that they can be collaborative partners and learn how to consume and utilize data science supports, tools, techniques. So know enough to be able to partner and collaborate. That's stage one. Stage two is all of our social science educational programming and on the side, when we're all educated in how we do this, needs to start to move beyond just statistical training for those that are and sort of qualitative research, and really needs to bring a third leg which is all of these data science, machine learning, and sort of big data techniques also into the training and education, such that it is a more integral part of this, because right now the two camps sit in different departments at universities. So we need a more integrated academic training around bringing data science into the social sciences. Right now they are siloed, and we need to bring those together.
Perfect. Thanks so much to our esteemed panelists. We are about 6 minutes over, and we're going to now turn to a little bit of a break before we then start with our second panel, again with Swapnil Shankar from Sambodi and Jos Vassen of the World Bank's Independent Evaluation Group. Before we wrap up, you did see a slide. Could you go back one slide? With a list of resources which will be available on the same page that you registered. And there will be the recording. There are many of the resources that were mentioned throughout this presentation, and you will also have, of course, the slide deck. So thank you very much for those signing off, and for those joining it back on. We will start probably 2 minutes after the half hour. Signing off. Bye-bye. Hello, everyone. For those who are coming back from your break or just joining us, we will be starting in about 1 minute. Thanks very much. So as we get started with this next session, I did want to remind everyone that if you missed the first part of the presentation, it is recorded and will be available tomorrow. And second of all, that there is a resource page in which, number one, is already updated with many of the resources that were mentioned earlier, additional resources, as well as will be updated with anything that might come up during this part of the conversation. So I think we might be ready. I'm looking for my cue. When I get that, we will start.
Sylvia, please let us know when you're ready.
Great. Sounds like we're ready. So hello and welcome back for many of you. And for those of you who are just joining, I am Veronica Olazabal. I am a senior advisor and director of measurement and evaluation and performance or organizational performance at the Rockefeller Foundation. Today's event, very importantly, is sponsored by the World Bank's Independent Evaluation Group and the Rockefeller Foundation in support of the Center for Learning and Evaluation Results, CLEAR, as many of you know, CLEAR's gLocal Week. We are excited to present part 2 of a panel focused on the intersection between data science and evaluation. Next slide, please. Great. So as a reminder, we are joined by about 600 people from all over the world and across many sectors, including academic and multilateral, but very importantly, the private sector, as the private sector has very much started thinking very critically about what this is. And it's nice to see both private and public sectors coming together on this particular topic. Next slide, please. So the way that we are going to handle this session, a little bit different than the last session if you joined, is we're going to hear a full-on from Swapnil and full-on from Jose, and we're not going to stop for questions except in between the two. However, as questions start coming to you, please do populate the chat box through the PollEv function and application. And also, very importantly, please tell us your name and where you're calling from. Next slide, please. So as mentioned earlier, these sessions are inspired by a recent publication by the Rockefeller Foundation called Measuring Results and Impact in the Age of Big Data, the Nexus of Evaluation, Analytics, and Digital Technology by our previous panelists, Pete York and Michael Bamberger. We did follow up with a blog post on rewiring how we measure impact in this new world that we're living in. And those two web links are listed on the resource page. Now we are going to turn to some of the organizational implications. If you could move to the next slide, please. So, as you can imagine, this world looks different based on whether you're based at a donor agency, at an implementation agency, at a private company, or even if you're an impact investor. At the Rockefeller Foundation, we have an opportunity to use our capital in innovative ways. And as such, we are testing different models of bringing data science and social science together. During this part of the presentation, we're going to learn more about some of the practical implications of bringing these two areas together through the lens of both an implementation agency as well as an independent evaluation group. And we're going to start off with our colleague Swapnil Shekhar, who works for an organization called Sambodhi Research and Communications based in India. Swapnil, just to make sure you're there, could you turn on your video?
Yeah, I'm here, Veronica.
Perfect, perfect, perfect. So Swapnil is co-founder and COO at Samvodi, based in South Asia, and he leads impact evaluation and research for the development and public sector. Swapnil has more than 20 years of experience driving large-scale measurement, learning, and evaluation projects across Asia and Africa, and is an active contributor to the Global South Development Narrative and Field. Welcome, Swapnil. So Swapnil, from your field-based perspective, what does it really look like to apply a data science approach to evaluation? Over to you, Swapnil.
Thank you, Veronica. As an evaluator, I'm very optimistic about data science applications in evaluation. Let me share a few of my learnings with you all. Hello, friends. I'm glad to be a part of this discussion. Thank you, IEG and the Rockefeller Foundation for putting up this fantastic event. I also congratulate Michael, Pete, and Veronica for their publication, Measuring Results and Impact in the Age of Big Data, the Nexus of Evaluation, Analytics, and Digital Technology. The first round of discussions have comfortably set the agenda for me. Without much ado, I think I should plunge into it. I have 3 slides and around 12 minutes with me. So I'll drive the discussions towards a developing country context and bring in the perspective of an M&E service provider into play. My presentation is based on our learnings primarily from India. I'll start with stating the opportunity and then talk about challenges both from the supply and the demand sides. We also talk about solutions in the same context. Next, please. Let me start with a cliched sentence, and that is India thrives amidst multiple paradoxes. We have remarkable access to technology, but unfortunately, socializing technology is skewed and not so representative. Having said that, if you see the last decade, we've seen phenomenal growth with respect to enabling data and technology in social development context. What does it mean? I have a few points around it. As practitioners, we've seen the emergence of real-time or near real-time data, administrative data for decision-making for many of the government flagships, both at the national as well as federal levels. Our largest rural employment scheme, water and sanitation schemes, the large-scale financial inclusion program that we have are all built on robust data architecture. Similarly, to strengthen program delivery, our tech-enabled frontline workers have also become rich source of implementation data, and that too real-time or near real-time. Also, in the last 10 years, what we've seen is the focus has been on creating unique identification for citizens. There are pitfalls to it as well. We have seen other conversations around it, but this has opened up to transformative data abilities on issues like social security, financial inclusion, and entitlements. India, we all know that it is blooming with tech innovation ecosystem as well. Focus on tech innovations in spaces like education, agriculture, public health has created a fertile ground for data science application. Having said that, as an organization working with large-scale primary data, we see that the appetite to use data generated from these sources for evaluative purposes is improving. When I say evaluative purposes, I say it with a pinch of salt. I mean that for evaluative purposes, it's more from a program feedback purposes than from an outcome measurement or causality lens. So that's the difference then when we talk about evaluative purposes in a data science context. Next slide, please. This slide, we talk about the unique challenges that a country like India poses when it comes to data science application in the realm of evaluation. We have a few we pose a few distinct challenges. Let me state a few. To start with, the most critical challenge is about availability of data to sufficiently address diversity and complexity of interventions. Context becomes paramount. With this, I'm also reinforcing what Michael's point on complexity. We have used administrative data, supply-side data from institutions to feedback program implementation. But given the diversity, both socio-demographically and federally, it does not serve the complete purpose. Let's take an example. If we talk about, say, contraceptive usage without knowing about the socio-cultural context or intra-household power relationship, it's difficult to read much into the data. The second point is about data culture. We all know culture is a very slow moving construct. Having said that, while we have enabled data architecture at institutions and frontline workers, data input is often driven by the fear of being judged or held accountable for. There was a question in the first session around data quality as an input, and I'll try to address that not as a response, but as a problem. So data input is often driven by the fear of being judged or held accountable for. For example, a health facility reporting maternal mortality, or a frontline worker reporting immunization or say pregnancy registration. These occasions are also driven by incentives. So you can imagine the kind of motivation or that works on data input as well. The third and a very important point is about disparate receptivity. What does it mean? Over the last few years, we've seen growing appreciation for data science in developing programs or calibrating intensity of interventions. We've observed machine learning being used to develop interventions in early education, in public health, in other areas as well. But having said that, data science as a tool for program evaluation is still in its nascency, its early stages for it. And appetite for it is varied across institutions. Fortunately, this variety is agnostic in nature. It is across public institutions, it's across private institutions as well. I won't spend time on talking about representativeness. Michael has already spoken about it. In India is no different when it comes to skewness and application of data sciences. Last point, which is essentially the closest to me personally, is data science in our context loses much of its sheen if not interlocked with human demographic data. We need to explore mechanisms where data science and primary surveys can talk to each other. We will talk more about it in the next slide, but this is something that we need to understand in the context of India. We depend on something like, say, geospatial data without actually understanding the context, the demography of where geospatial data belongs to. This is something that we need to embed together. Next slide, please. This is the slide on solutioning. When you talk about India context solutions, COVID is something that we need to talk about, and we cannot avoid talking about it. COVID and beyond, we see a huge shift happening towards the way we collect data. Data has to get cheaper, faster, and more reliable. In this setting, let's talk about how designing solutions would shape up data collection per se. I'll pick up the last point from the previous slide of mine, where we talked about the need of having primary services to build in together with data sciences. India-centric solutions has to look into extending data science application to demand-side data as well. We are yet to unravel much of the demand-side eccentricities and behavior, and for this, demand-side assessments becomes mandatory. You cannot avoid that. Let me quote an example from the clean cooking space. In one of our engagements with the Data Trust, we have dovetailed emission measurement sensors in cook stoves with demographic and behavioral indicators on a longitudinal panel of households. This is the kind of solution that I'm talking about. The next point on data collection per se is one about reliability. One of the ways to get reliable and powerful data is to create tech-enabled longitudinal panels. Longitudinal panel is something that is not new. We have been talking about longitudinal panel for ages now. But what I'm talking, the difference that COVID has also reinforced is that longitudinal panel has to be enabled with tech. Tech interface data collection would also reduce cost of data. We all know for a fact that social sector has been hugely dependent on long and often very extractive physical surveys. COVID and data collection during COVID has increased the appreciation for distant, smart, and less time-consuming data collection for evaluations. But evaluations with a pinch of salt is still not evaluation. These are light touch assessments, but we see a silver lining when it comes to light touch investments in data collection as well. This can open up door for data sciences in time to come. Last point is about going beyond data collection when we see possibilities in there. In the last couple of years, we have seen emergence of private sector with data which is relevant in the SDG context as well. The private sector has access to vast amounts of big data, whether it be payment behavior, usage information, satellite geospatial data, etc. So there is, we see emergence of this data, and we see mechanisms through which data can be used in our context as well. Data initiatives like the one driven by the Rockefeller Foundation and MasterCard is on data philanthropy is one of the examples towards it as well. Having said that, I do believe that we need to have very strong advocacy towards socializing data as a public good, especially if it concerns achieving SDGs. Much needs to be done. Public good is something that typically a telephone company doesn't see its data to be. So we have to, if you are looking at designing solutions for a country like India, this has to be made public good through concerted efforts of all the stakeholders in the ecosystem. Next, please. I close it here. Thanks a lot.
Many thanks, Swapnil, for that very concise presentation. One question that was asked earlier that I think you're well positioned to reflect upon for us from the field perspective is, how do you solve for the concern of non-representative data privacy of vulnerable communities, whether they be using satellite imagery to identify illegal settlements, or which might expose vulnerable groups to repercussions? Over to you, Swapnil, for your thoughts on this.
Yeah, especially in context of sub-Saharan Africa and India and other Southeast Asian countries, we need to, and I reinforce that in our presentation as well, because tech-enabled data has a possible skew in areas where you have more tech density or more tech education for that matter. We need to supplement that with, for now at least, we need to supplement that with more robust sampling on ground, with a few physical surveys, maybe light touch physical surveys, which can help us understand the lay of the land better before we actually analyze data which is coming out of tech interfaces.
Excellent. And we have a question from Jordan from the USA. Swapnil, do you have any suggestions on how data scientists and or evaluators can determine if data sets are of high enough quality to use them for a project like this?
We see that administrative data, when you talk about administrative data, where there you have possibilities of error at different levels. But when you look at, say, a mobile payment data, it's a very factual data. Error syndromes are rare to find. But administrative data, there are certain trends which we can understand by the sheer logic of it. We in India, when we work with administrative data, we validate that administrative data through different mechanisms as well. So once the validation happens, the validation algorithms will work beyond a certain point of time as well. So there are mechanisms, there are checks and balances to determine whether administrative data is has a use value or not. And going forward, I think culturally as well, we are improving the quality of administrative data that on the ground implementation generates.
Perfect. And I have one more question for you before we turn over to Joost. What are the limitations or risks of encouraging the use of data science or big data?
Unfortunately, appreciation or understanding or shared understanding of data sciences in India is poor. We understand big data differently. And somehow it's not a panacea. We used to think the last 3 years we have understood that you have to, it's a long way when we start applying data sciences over evaluation or substituting it. Data sciences has to, what do you call it, get into, in fact, Veronica, can you repeat the question? The last bit?
Sorry, the last question?
Yeah.
Okay, let me see. The last question is, What are the limitations or risks of encouraging the use of data science or big data? From your perspective, Swapna, from the field.
Yeah, the risk essentially is for us, it's not socialized enough. The technology availability of data is not socialized enough. For me, in urban settings, I can deduce certain things, certain outputs out of big data that gets generated. This is less riskier, but when it comes to using other services or other data points, it's still untested whether big data applications can be used in evaluation conditions. So we are a bit behind when it comes to understanding evaluation in the big data context in India, especially in rural settings.
Excellent, Swapnil. Thank you very much. And I thought that was an excellent question and segue from the last panel where we talk about the big theory and the big frameworks and the large risks, but also the very promising opportunities. And then we move to the field of application. And your response very much demonstrates that we still have a long way to go to be able to be in that reality where we're at that perfect middle ground of combining data science, data analytics, the use of big data for evaluation. And so we are still building that muscle. So thank you very much, Swapnil. I'm going to turn over to our next panelist, Jos Vassen, who is from our host, the Independent Evaluation Group. And Jos, would you mind turning on your video if it's not on yet? Great. So Jos is a methods advisor at the World Bank. His publications include Impact Evaluations and Development, NONI Guidance on Impact Evaluation, Mind the Gap, Perspectives on Policy Evaluation and the Social Sciences, and along with Michael Bamberger, Dealing with Complexity in Development Evaluation, a Practical Approach. So Jos, welcome. You sit within an independent evaluation group. What does the convergence of data science and evaluation look like from your vantage point? Over to you, Jos.
Thank you very much, Veronica. Can you hear me well? Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, excellent. So, dear colleagues, good morning and good afternoon to you, and also my esteemed colleagues who are on the panel. Thank you for excellent and insightful presentations. It is a pleasure to discuss with you the use of big data and data science techniques in the context of independent evaluation, which is a little bit different, a specific type of entity within the broader institutional landscape of evaluation functions and evaluation practices. Next slide, please. So my talk is centered around three concise topics. So the first topic emphasizes the idea that evaluation is not a monolithic field of work. There are actually very different types of evaluation and very different ways in which evaluation is organized and linked to learning and accountability processes. And for simplicity purposes, I will distinguish between embedded evaluation and independent evaluation. And the reason why I'm doing this is that the implications for applying big data and new data science techniques are in some ways quite different. My second topic is to briefly illustrate to you some ways on how data science techniques can make a real difference in evaluative practice in the context of independent evaluation. And finally, I will conclude with some considerations on the use of data science techniques and big data going forward. So next slide, please. So embedded evaluation is a term I use to refer to evaluative practices that are closely connected to specific interventions, such as projects or activities within projects. And there's a direct link between the activity of evaluation and the intervention cycle. By contrast, independent evaluation concerns evaluative work that takes place in an institutional function that is in a way safeguarded from any influence from management. Embedded evaluations are much more closely linked to learning and program improvement. They may be conducted retrospectively, but it also includes real-time evaluations. It includes developmental evaluations where the objective of the evaluation is to improve the intervention itself. The unit of analysis, or the evaluant, is comparatively simple, which is an intervention activity or a project. By contrast, independent evaluation tends to provide a strategic helicopter view of an organization's or a country's work in a particular area, and reports to the highest levels of political leadership, such as a board or parliament. And evaluants, that what is being evaluated, tend to be much larger in scope and more complex, such as country programs, regional programs, or global thematic areas of work. So the implications are that embedded evaluations are often much more focused and narrower in scope, while independent evaluations have a broader scope and also have more complicated multi-level designs and are conducted by larger teams with more specialized expertise. So this is just to give you a background to understand better the context of independent evaluation as it is currently practiced in the world of multilateral development banks, UN organizations, bilateral agencies, and also many national government institutions, especially in the center of government, also at the line industry. And it lays the foundation for my discussion of what are some of the prospects and challenges of using new data science techniques. Next slide, please. So let me briefly give you 3 examples on how big data changes evaluative practice in the context of independent evaluation. And the first example is about identifying the evaluant. What do we actually evaluate? And here, traditionally, evaluators had to manually piece together what exactly has been happening under a particular policy or thematic area of work. And as you can imagine, this is quite daunting, especially if we talk about a global thematic area of work or a sectoral program. So when we use machine learning, where actually pieces of text in existing project documents are big data, one can much more efficiently identify a portfolio of work related to a particular theme. Next slide, please. So how does such a process work? Well, basically, it's an iterative process of training a data set, so mostly using what we call supervised learning techniques. It involves often some kind of targeted keyword searches, some parameters for identifying if fragments of text in the source documents comply with a particular category or a particular construct. In this case, it is, for example, the salience of particular keywords or the clustering of particular keywords. And then you iteratively kind of review the output. You throw out false positives and you fine-tune the keyword sequences and then throw it back into the data set. So in this way, we can identify a portfolio of work not only more efficiently, but also with a higher degree of accuracy than with tedious manual review. Next slide, please. So the second example concerns an important trend in evaluation. Increasingly, evaluators are synthesizers. As was already said earlier, there are thousands and thousands of documents available in an institutional organization or in the external literature. So going through these documents manually is very, very tedious. So doing this is in a semi-automated way, using data science, again with text as big data, we can extract such text in a much more reliable and comprehensive manner, and again more efficiently. So what we did in IEG was to set up a system of semi-automated information extraction from our private sector project evaluation reports, where we used a particular taxonomy of project performance related lessons that we have been increasingly fine-tuning over time. Next slide, please. So what does this generate in terms of outputs? There's two types of outputs. So first of all, it generates a data file that shows all relevant sections of text that refer to a particular area of project performance. So it summarizes basically particular challenges under the taxonomy, and that you can use then subsequently for narrative synthesis. Second, the knowledge extraction and classification process is also connected to a data visualization platform where you can produce all sorts of descriptive statistics by industry, region, and so on. Next slide, please. My final example concerns broadening the range of questions that one can answer. For example, traditionally, impact evaluation, which is of course very, very prominently visible in the evaluation world, in the sense of counterfactual analysis using quasi-experimental and experimental designs is actually largely outside of the realm of independent evaluation because it has a very micro-oriented focus, typically on a particular intervention activity, and is also quite expensive. So a lot of resources for a relatively comparatively limited scope of the evaluation. And even though independent evaluation functions have substantial budgets for evaluation, they also have a large scope to cover. So now with the availability of new data, so for example, remote sensing data, such as satellite imagery data, some of these data are open access or available at very low cost. New options are opening up for doing impact evaluation. Next slide, please. So for specific interventions that have clear spatial effects, for example, a road construction project, we can use now spatial counterfactual designs to try and estimate the net effect using various proxies of outcome variables. So in this case, that would be changes in land use over time or changes in the built-up environment over time. And we can then use difference in difference estimations or some kind of regression discontinuity model to control for other variation explaining differences in land use over time. Next slide, please. So to conclude, let me highlight a few points. To start, I have illustrated that indeed there are potentially many useful ways in which data science techniques can enhance the quality, efficiency, or the breadth of evaluative work in the context of independent evaluation. At the same time, there are also typical characteristics of independent evaluation that influence the prospects for doing so and also pose some challenges. So overall, independent evaluation, because of the way it is institutionalized and connected to the broader organizational system, tends to be less dynamic and innovative than the much more diverse and I would say disorganized field of embedded evaluations, where one can find pockets of innovation that are much more dynamic. So in a way, independent evaluation functions are lagging behind the curve for innovation for all sorts of reasons. Some of them have to do with institutional reasons. On the other hand, we also see that the size and budgets of some evaluations in the framework of independent evaluation, that they offer a scope for more innovation when particular applications, data science applications, require more expertise and resources. So in addition to this, I would like to highlight 4 more points. So first of all, given the fact that evaluants may be quite large and complex, they may span various countries, various levels of interventions, types of interventions, multiple causal pathways. I think there's a difference between data science techniques and types of big data that can be applied in the margin of such complex evaluations and ones that touch upon the core of these more complex evaluations. So in my examples, the 2 text analytics examples are applications that really touch at the core of evaluative work, and incentives to apply them may be quite high. By contrast, the geospatial impact evaluation example, here we're actually talking about a case study or even part of a case study and a much broader evaluation, and the incentives and the space to actually use data science techniques is very different here. The second point is building capacities, which is very important, of course. I will be short because it has been discussed a lot. I'm not so much referring to the capacity in data science expertise as such. One should hire or contract qualified researchers with data science skills. I'm referring mostly to the challenge of actually changing the awareness and knowledge of evaluators who work in independent evaluation units, so they better understand and acknowledge also the potential for data science applications to be used in their work. I see this as a big challenge. There are all sorts of reasons underneath this. This brings me to a third point, which relates to the previous one. So this also has been discussed at length, so it will be short. In order for data science applications to be successfully applied, we really need a close interaction between the data scientist and the evaluator. Pete has discussed this at length. A data scientist really cannot interpret the patterns in the data that are found in many cases. He or she cannot train a data set without substantive inputs from from an evaluator or subject specialist. So this is not something that can be simply outsourced. You need a very, very close collaboration between these areas. And finally, a very short remark. As with any new kid on the block, although some aspects are much older, let it not dictate what happens on the block. We saw this in the impact evaluation movement, which has been strongly methods-driven, largely driven by an RCT-driven approach. And here, there's a little bit of a risk that we fall into a similar trap here. I think we all agree that methods and data should follow the questions and not the other way around. So with this point, let me close here. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Jos. And so I am still moderating, and we will turn to a full panel Q&A piece after we take a couple of questions specifically to your presentation. And so I encourage the audience and participants to please input your questions and your name and country into the POLEV application on your screens and also accessible from where you are watching. So Jos, in the meantime, we have a methodological question. How can we use data to support triangulation when we don't have access to populations for evaluation? Over to you.
Thank you. That's a very good question. So the strength of inference in any evaluative analysis usually relies on, the quality of the data that you can bring to bear, and often also the multiple sources of data from multiple angles that you can bring to bear to see whether these different information elements converge. So assuming this question refers to a context where we cannot go to the field and we cannot actually talk to people, we cannot talk to people who implemented an intervention, or people who talked to people who may have benefited. So there are various important building blocks. So first of all, we need a very, very strong theory around how we hypothesize that interventions work. This comes from external literature on the effectiveness of this type of interventions in different contexts. It comes from project experience within the organization, existing project documents. Then we need to find any data sets that can tell us something about the characteristics and the context of the evaluation. What type of populations of beneficiaries are we talking about? What type of context are we talking about? What are the characteristics of the intervention? And then finally, hopefully we have project documentation that can tell us something about whether interventions in similar contexts have worked or not, and what can we infer from that, all the way using the theory as a guiding element to develop our explanatory story, where we use data from these different angles to triangulate, to really understand the causal narrative. There are more issues to this, but this would be an example. Thanks.
Excellent. So I am going to actually open it up. We have a couple of minutes left, and we want to be able to have a rich discussion between Swapnil and Jos. So Swapnil, would you mind turning on your video? Great. Okay, perfect. So we see. So welcome back, everyone. I hope you can see me too. Yes, you can see me too. Okay, perfect. So we had a rich discussion. We saw the differences from the first session where we talked about the big picture to this piece where we talk about application. And we also learned a little bit about what the reality is in terms of implementation in the field from an implementation organization such as Sambodi, as well as very much deconstructing what the experience is like from where multilateral DFI sits, and really looking at the differences between the embedded type of model for an evaluator working on data science potentially, and the more arm's length independent model. And so thank you very much for those various perspectives. One question for you, and I think this one probably Swapnil, your best position to answer is, can you describe instances of collaboration between data scientists and evaluators in India? And this comes from a fellow person from India. Swapnil, over to you.
Not many that I know, but I'll give you an example from our own work. We recently concluded an evaluation for a large-scale livelihood intervention, where the evaluation was coupled with another piece where image processing or analytics was getting used to a certain asset level changes, household asset level changes. So these were two parallel activities, and one was conventional evaluation where we were doing a difference in difference estimate. It was coupled with a data analytics arm, which was talking about image analytics. This is one of the instances. There are a couple of other examples in primary education where we have seen machine learning algorithms have been used to design intervention, and later it also has been used for evaluative purposes as well. There have been unsuccessful collaborations as well. I can name many of them.
Excellent. And we have a question from Paul from Guyana. How can we begin using data analysis if we're just getting started? How can we get started and build capacity? And I know, Joost, that you mentioned that we had talked a little bit about this earlier on. I think the audience would like to hear from your perspective, sitting where you are sitting, and your particular journey to where you are today.
Thank you. This is a very good question. So the way I would approximate it is
Oh, Joost, I think we might have lost your audio. Still can't hear you. Still can't hear you. So we're going to turn to Swapnil while we figure out what's happening with Joost's audio. Perhaps maybe unplug. Okay, he's going to figure that out. Swapnil, you're now in the hot seat. So from your perspective, how do we begin using data analysis if we are just getting started? And how can we get started in building capacity?
From an M&E service provider lens, we have been traditionally engaged in conventional evaluations. And for us also, it's a steep learning curve. In the last 3 years, we have had immersions on data analytics internally to the organization as well. There are two mechanisms to develop. One is you organically develop capacities of your colleagues, of the teams that you work in. There are many trainings that are happening. There are many courses that are there. And the inorganic way and the expensive way is to have a data science team, which is not the best way to move forward, because at the end of the day, you're also contributing to larger field building activity. For me, we are doing organically.
Excellent. And I think we have Joost back.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you. And sorry, I think we started to hear you, but we did not get very far.
Yeah, sorry. Some problem in the virtual connection, the transatlantic virtual connection, perhaps. So the way I would approximate it is that I would look at different types of evaluation questions and how they relate to different methods. So there are a couple of methods, and I use now Pete's taxonomy, that are more in the qualitative sphere. Interviews, focus groups are really central data collection techniques that happen that are used in evaluation, and they can be connected to computer-assisted qualitative data analysis to process the data. Then there is also the more quantitative realm, where we use surveys or we use secondary data sets then to do statistical analysis of more the conventional kind. And then you, of course, have the more advanced, newer space of data science techniques. All of these require very different skills, but it is important to start making the inventory, starting to think about what types of evaluation questions you are asking, what are the dimensions of interest you're looking at, and many of those already automatically link to particular types of methods. And from there on, you can think about, okay, what are the types of trainings that I use? How do I want to staff my team or my evaluation unit, and going forward?
Excellent. Thanks so much. So now I have many questions coming in. One of the, but I think one of the questions that we didn't really spend too much time on earlier, and I'd be interested in hearing your perspectives, is from our colleague Ninoy from the Philippines, asked, how big should the data set be to qualify as big data? And so, we talk a lot about this big data, and I know, Jos, we've talked a lot about that and the difference between big data science, perhaps that Michael was referring to earlier, data science. So from your perspective, and Swapnil, I'd be curious about your point of view as well. How big does it really have to be in order to qualify for big data? And can data science be applicable for little data too?
Would you like me to start, Veronica?
Oh, yes, please. You have
I actually think this would be a typical question I would ask Pete. He probably has a very good response to this. But let me give you my take. So when we talk about large, big data, we are talking about a definition which refers to data that are available almost in real time, high velocity. Think about financial transaction data. Think about satellite imagery where the data points may be pixels. Here we are dealing with millions and millions of observations. So obviously we're in the big data sphere, and the techniques that we use and the processing capacity that we use are in the realm of data science. Now the cutoff point between what we would call large data is not very clear, but here we may be talking about, let's say, the more conventional data sets, census data or survey data, which may go in the thousands or even in the hundreds of thousands, but that we traditionally analyze using the more traditional multivariate statistical techniques. Once we move into much larger numbers of data, then both in terms of techniques and processing capacity, we have to look for different solutions. And of course, the big data definition also includes the combining of different data sets. So there's a data warehousing perspective in that you do not see, let's say, as clearly in the large data analysis.
Thank you. And Swapnil, so what's your perspective on this?
I echo what Josh was saying, and just to comment on the last bit on data science. Yes, data science can be applied on not so big data as well. So that is the simple understanding that we have on data science.
Excellent. And I would say we had a lively debate about this earlier as we were preparing for this conversation around, whether or not longitudinal data actually qualified as big enough to apply data science to. And so I think that there is certainly a need to clarify the big data as an actual data type. Yeah. I've talked to many data scientists out there, and they would typically describe big data as so much data it fills roomfuls of computers. And so we're talking about terabytes of data. Versus large data sets, which we as evaluators are sometimes accustomed to. So great. So there is a question from Tammy from New York City. How can we address the noise and biases such that is coming from the COVID-19 context in evaluations when looking at short-term responses without missing sight of the medium to long-term projections for planning purposes? And particularly when original models might no longer apply to realities. So perhaps as the methods expert shows, you can start us off. Yeah. How do we address the noise and the bias in the space? Oh, Josh, I think we might have lost you again. Sorry for the transatlantic connection. Mm-hmm. Yes, so let's turn to Swapnil. Swapnil, what are your perspectives on the bias and noise?
Yeah, I may not be the best located when it comes to responding to this, but having said that, most of the evaluations that we are undertaking now is getting exposed to what we are calling as a COVID syndrome. And we are COVID-proofing every tool, every method that we are using in the field right now. So there are some excellent resources that are available, open resources that are available to how to actually COVID-proof your methodology and your tools, your variables. I can share the links with you later today. So that is something that we can do. So we've been using a couple of sources to COVID-proof our tools and methods.
Excellent, and I appreciate your term COVID-proof. And so we'll share with the audience that anything that is mentioned during this session will be added to the resource page that will be available for the participants after this particular webinar. I think Yost is still reconnecting. I did have a qualifier from Pete York, who is also out there watching us. And he, in reference to the question around how big is big data, he says, big data also pertains to how many machine learning algorithms are required to process the data. So there you have it. So going back to an earlier question as Yost continues to reconnect, Tassin from the UN in Dhaka, Swapnil, he says, or asks, success of big data analytics depends on how the predictions and model outcomes are utilized by decision makers. In intuitively understanding recommendations from analytical exercises and debating potential outcomes, are big data analytics somewhat more inaccessible to decision makers compared to traditional evaluation approaches? Excellent, excellent question. So perhaps we'll start with Swapnil, and I believe Josh is back. He says he's here. We cannot see you, Josh, or maybe we can, and I cannot see you, but your camera is not on. So Swapnil, over to you. Is big data analytics more or less accessible than traditional evaluation?
This is not a binary, actually, Veronica. So depending on, we have to take it case to case basis. Big data is accessible or is not accessible is a matter of context, is a matter of geography that you belong to. It's a matter of technology access that you have. Similarly, conventional evaluation also has also is driven by many externalities. So there is no binary as such. I won't be able to actually have a binary response to it.
Perfect. And so Jos is with us. He just is not visible. Jos, I know that you got cut off earlier from the methodological question around noise and bias. Did you want to weigh in? Or sorry, yes, that was the question.
Yes. So actually, I would not approach this question first from the noise and bias perspective. I would start first with the conceptual perspective. So in the COVID-19 situation, we are dealing with processes of change that are very complex, and there are many unknown unknowns. So in the first realm, we have the public health system, and we have public health interventions. And then we have other priority interventions, such as social protection related interventions. But in the second realm, we have all sorts of effects that are happening due to government-imposed restriction measures, which also cause all sorts of changes. So any data collection and analysis approach and any evaluative approach would start with a mapping of both the priority interventions and priority sectors. What are the interventions and what are the right outcome data to see whether something is successful or not, and then also try to map out, okay, what will be important secondary effects and what interventions, if any, are launched there to mitigate those secondary effects. And what are some of the data on outcomes that we want to gather here. And then we can start talking about the different data sets, and then it helps us interpret what biases we find in some of the data. But this is a longer conversation, obviously.
We can't hear you, Veronica.
Sorry about that. So you both raised the question around whether implicitly or explicitly of a little bit of this binary that we're in, where we talk about data science or evaluation. And so when we're thinking about this nexus space, one of the questions that we've received is, are there different types of questions that are somewhat answerable in this new area that we're in, integrating data science, big data, and evaluation versus in your more traditional goal-oriented type of evaluation? And so as from a methods perspective, Swapnil, do you want to just start us off? Are the questions different?
Questions are definitely different, and that is where the apprehension of substituting conventional evaluation with a big data evaluation comes in from. Big data or big data based evaluation are to be smarter, shorter, real time, while we are used to, conventionally our evaluations end up having, say, 2 hours long questionnaires. So you can't afford doing something like that with big data. So that's the challenge. When you're talking about theory-based evaluations, when you're talking about validating theories, then it's difficult with big data. I'm talking about the current discipline. It is evolving, and I'm not exposed to that evolution much. But I'm sure in the time to come we can test that as well. But for now, that's the difference I see.
Great. And Jos, would you like to weigh in on the question?
So if we talk about questions as evaluation questions, I think not necessarily the evaluation questions change. So the users of evaluation, whether it's funders or the board or implementers or other stakeholders, do not start necessarily asking different questions because there are now data science applications available. What happens is that the different evaluation questions around dimensions of efficiency, effectiveness, impact, coherence, relevance, etc., they can be looked at more efficiently in some cases. We can derive deeper and higher quality responses on some of these questions. And in the case of the independent evaluation function, some of the questions we can actually, some of the sub-questions we can analyze more effectively in a way that we were not able to do before. So that would be my.
Thank you very much. And that question came from Amadou in Australia. And so we have 2 minutes left, and we will unfortunately have to wrap up. There's one big question that has come in that I think would be excellent to hear your thoughts on. And then I have a question to wrap us up. So please be short and succinct. The big question: should evaluators fear big data? How can we reduce our fears? And so Swapnil, over to you first.
It's an existential question for me as well. I'm a conventional evaluator. So, having said that, we should not scare because the ethos would remain the same. You are, at the end of the day, you are providing feedback to the program implementation, and the idea is to improve program implementation. That ways, I'm not scared personally. So for us, everything is evolving. We have organically learned evaluation, and so we would data science as well.
And Jos, your thoughts?
I think evaluators should fear ignoring big data. So I mean, this is something that will change the business of data collection and data analysis going forward. At the same time, I think evaluators do not need to fear that it's going to take over the evaluation business. I think Pete said it quite well. The data scientist has a supporting role. So the substantive work is led by the evaluator. The evaluator knows how to interpret the reality, knows how to ask the evaluative questions, has knowledge of the substance matter, and also very importantly, is an expert in the valuing business. So remember Michael Scriven, he talked about fact premises and valuing premises. And a lot of the work that we do as evaluators is making sense of a finding that comes out of an analysis. What does it mean that this was the effect? Is that good enough or not? Or are there any other effects that we should take into account? So I do not think evaluators should fear that they get out of business, but they should fear that leaning back into their chair and not taking into account the things that are happening, the very interesting things that are happening in the data science realm.
Many thanks to our esteemed panelists for their provocative thoughts. So it sounds like there are many promising areas where data science can contribute to evaluation, but there's still a lot that needs to be learned. As we wrap up, I have one more question, be it existential, for Swapnil and Jos, and that is, if you could fast forward to 2030, which is a big year in the global development space, 2030, what would evaluators be doing differently based on this new data science world we are living in? Swapnil, over to you first.
So we have answered the existential question now. But 2030 is the time when I personally see that human-centered data becomes more accessible ethically and at minimal costs. We open up for real-time feedback. We are yet to open up. We talk about real-time feedback, but we don't incorporate that. The uptake is very slow. So we open up for uptake as well and unpack complexities better. Michael is on the show, so we have to talk about complexities. We have to unpack complexities more than what we have done. I also echo what Pete was saying. Pete was talking about field building. Being a Global South organization, we have invested our energies a lot on field building on M&E. We have advocated the need of M&E being part of our curriculum. Now it's the time when we also talk about data science in our curriculum. Global South has been slow when it comes to incorporating evaluation as a part of the curriculum. Now we also have the challenge of introducing data science through an evaluative lens in our curriculum. We have to blur the silos that we are working in. 2030 sometimes is a time when we see that there would not be any silos.
Many thanks. And Jos, what should we be doing as we fast forward to 2030?
Yeah, well, that's a very difficult question that merits its own long debate, but a few points. So first of all, a lot depends on the demand side. So hopefully we are moving towards an era where the decision makers, also in consultation with the general public or through feedback mechanisms, are asking more and more for better evidence to influence decision making and learning, because that really drives the production of evidence, evaluative evidence based on good data, and also the investments in data collection. So hopefully we have that trend happening. The second thing is that we will have a new generation of evaluators coming up in the ranks who have been educated differently through their graduate training programs. And they are a lot more data savvy than some of the let's say the current generation of evaluators. So that will be a very positive thing. They will be much more attuned to issues around data standards, data warehousing, various forms of data analytics. So I think that is also a very important trend that is going to happen. There are many more points, but I'll leave it at that.
Many thanks. So colleagues, thank you for joining us today. One final message from me is a reminder to check the website for the video tomorrow and resources. We will update it in the coming days. Thank you again for attending, and to our speakers, and tune into other sessions during gLocal Evaluation Week 2020. Signing off now. Have a good evening, day, night.